The gender pay gap in Australian companies is getting narrower, but not by much, and just 1 in 5 businesses has eliminated it. New data shows the gap between what men and women earn is large and persistent. Business reporter Daniel Ziffer joins me now for more on this. So Dan, take us through the new data.
This is an immense amount of information that any Australian can access. It talks about companies with more than 100 people. So that covers about 5.3 million Australians at more than 10,000 entities. They can go right now to the ABC website, plug in their employer and find out what the gender pay gap is, where they are and how that ranks compared to different peers in the same industry. There is a large and persistent gender pay gap. For the numbers, let's go to Mary Wooldridge from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency.
So the national gender pay gap is 21.8%, which means that on average, for every dollar that a man earns, women earn 78 cents. So it's a big difference, but we are seeing positive signs. 56% of companies improved their gender pay gap in the last 12 months. So we've got progress. We need to accelerate that change.
So that's Mary Wooldridge from WGEA, who collect the data which companies have to submit. So when you're talking about the gender pay gap, we're talking here about the average earnings of men and women in the same company. This is not about equal pay for equal work. That is the law. We're talking about the gap. And at companies, it is very different. We're seeing big disparities. For example, when we look at our big four banks, Westpac's gap is at 28% and getting worse, whereas some of the rivals in the same space, like NAB, have a gap closer to 14 or 15%. So really big disparities that people can look at for themselves and make their own choices, but very much reflective of a broad gap that exists in society and in Australian companies between what men and women on average earn.
So what have we learned this year?
Well, we get even more information now. It's only the second year that individual company details have been released. Previously, it was done in a kind of anonymised way. We didn't get a look in. Because it's the second year we can see movement. There's been some really positive movement from a lot of employers and some backsliding as well. What we also get is the inclusion of CEO pay. Now, the average is actually worse this year at 21.8%, and that's because CEOs tend to be the best paid person in an organisation, and overwhelmingly across Australia, they are men. That means that the gender pay gap has actually expanded by a fraction of a percentage point, but we'll get better data into the future. This really is a substantial moment where you can look in, and researchers will spend months poring over this to find out more about different industries, different sectors, why, for example, different sectors like construction, property and professional services continue to have much larger and more persistent gaps than others in society. For people who are looking for work, it's certainly an amazing look in at where you might sit and where you might fit in different companies. There's a lot in there.
And Dan, in the US under President Trump, there's been a push against diversity and inclusion measures. Does that show up in this data?
It doesn't show up in the data, but it certainly is an impact. For example, I went to a very large pharmaceutical company called GSK, spoke to some of the workers there. After those interviews, the global company based in the US and the UK announced that to comply with American law, it was rolling back some of its diversity initiatives. Now, it probably won't have as much effect here in Australia because a lot of these things are essentially legislated. They are Australian law. Every year, Australian companies must give their data to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. They must have a positive duty to try and prevent sexual harassment and to have a safe workplace. These aren't things they can sit back and wait for whistleblowers to come to them. They have what's called a positive duty, which means bosses and boards must be actively trying to prevent bad things happening at work. So a lot of that kind of architecture that exists in law, unless there is a change in that law, nothing will change here. All of those things will still have to occur, even as we see this kind of global regression away from what's been a push towards assisting marginalised and underrepresented groups over time.
Business reporter Daniel Ziffer there, thank you.